Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I'm Rhombus Tix. I'm going to be reading to you today another short story from my old stories list called the series I'm calling Swamp Castle. This is another one of 7 more stories that you've heard before on the podcast, but that I'm retelling to be able to create a video anthology on my YouTube channel with the same consistent sound, tone, and narration. So without further ado, I will now read Gatekeeper. Everyone complained silently at Hastur as Hastur let the unicorn through the line. They didn't complain too loudly because they didn't want to upset him. Feigned politeness and respect were a perk of the job, and the job didn't have many perks. Many of the others at the IINS really enjoyed their job. They hadn't become disenchanted with magic like Hastur had. Hastur didn't hate the people who crammed their way through the gate as individuals. He just hated magic. Here was something interesting. Someone was going to complain after all. This time it was a short old woman with a gnarled cane. Hastur's glasses could read her aura a mile away. She was a troublemaker with power. Nothing he couldn't handle. Gates were built like fortresses. "Why are you letting that unicorn cut ahead of everyone else in line?" she demanded, tapping her cane indignantly on the tiled floor. Hastur pointed to a large sign on the wall that said, "All unicorns admitted as United States citizens without review due to the Mary Virginia Act of 2022. It was utterly amazing what the tears of the Senate Majority Leader could do to ensure that all good unicorns in the cosmos got a good home in the United States of America. He swore he thought he saw it grin and wink at him as it walked through the line. He made a point not to give it the satisfaction of looking one way or the other, so he wasn't entirely sure. The woman looked at the sign in confusion and despair. She sat down with the others. Hastur actually felt sad for her. That was strange, really, because these days Hastur didn't feel sorry for many of the immigrants at all, particularly the ones that used magic. He sighed. As she shuffled off to her distant place in line, he said, "If you don't have your application processed by the end of the day, come back here. I'll see if I can help you do the paperwork better." Most immigrants, of the extra-dimensional variety anyway, had very little idea how to navigate the federal bureaucracy. That was fair. Neither did most of the citizens it protected. The rest of his shift was fine. People were almost pleasant to him for some reason. Maybe the old woman had some luck spells or something. That would make her application easier. Any nation worth its salt always took a bit more luck when they could get it. They were a lot more desirable than people trying to make money appear out of thin air. "Well, what are you waiting for?" she asked. "Nothing. Have you got your paperwork?" "Well, I managed to fill in my name, but that's about it. Pleased to meet you, Hastur." Hastur didn't recall giving her his name, but he wasn't impressed by the parlor trick. He ignored it and said, "You haven't filled out anything else? It should appear in your native language." "Oh, it does. I just don't understand most of the terms." "Right. How could someone rearrange the matter and energy of the cosmos and not understand a little paperwork?" It never made sense to him, yet he saw it a lot in the immigrant population, particularly amongst the older generations. "Can you help me?" So innocent seeming, this one was really dangerous. "Yes, I can help you, but I'll have to ask you a lot of questions. Some of it might seem very personal. It's very important for you to be totally honest with me." "Ask away. I'm not going anywhere," she said. "People call me Martha, by the way." "Nice to meet you, Martha. Martha, my name is Hastur." "The unspeakable?" "Not exactly. Old joke, geek parents. Very little affection for between the rest of the family and I." "That's terrible. Family's important." She patted his knee gently. "What was it about old ladies?" "Thanks. At any rate, like I said, lots of questions. Ready?" "Ready as I'll ever be," she cackled. Was that deliberate? And so Martha began to spill her life story through the filter of IINS paperwork. She'd come to America for the same reason almost all the others had, the fading. Out there in the echoes of the other world, something was making other worlds fade away. First it was the magic, then it was the kindness, and last of all was the life. Somehow, Earth was better because it hadn't used its magic for 1,000 years. Somehow, Hastur just didn't believe that. "You're too kind," Martha said as Hastur began to fill in the last few bits of corresponding identification numbers. "I'd like to pay you back." Hastur smiled. Thank you, ma'am, but doing good is reward enough. Seriously, I can't take payment for helping you with this. It's against regulations. It could cost me my job. No payment at all? She seemed insulted. Not really, I'm afraid. But if I just told you some useful information, Hastur held his hand up and shook his head. Someone could tell me about something useful. Someone could tell me about some useful stock tips or about a horse race, and it's illegal. All of it. She thought a moment. Is the knowing or the action that is illegal? He thought a moment. Well, I guess technically. What if the information would save your life? I don't think that counts as a monetary donation, he said. She smiled warmly and patted his knee. Good. I'd like to hope my new home is not populated entirely by idiots. Oh, it is, Hastur said without hesitation. Martha's eyes turned wide as they rolled up in her head. Her voice turned slightly contralto as she said, Your cynicism is your greatest strength and your greatest burden. You will be forced to choose between what you want and what you believe to be right. Helpful. Not that the advice was very specific. It was really wasn't that kind of thing. You will be eaten by a leopard in the next 12 hours. That was much more specific. What? Hastur didn't like the sound of that. Well, is there a way to avoid it? No, the voice said with dispassion. Then why bother telling me? You'll get better. Hastur was about to argue with the otherworldly advice when he realized it was answering his questions. Why was he wasting his time asking it pointless things he supposedly couldn't change anyway? When he could ask more interesting questions? He couldn't ask it anything of monetary value. The government employed the best diviners that money could buy, and Hastur despised those that found ways around salary restrictions. Any system could be fooled, and the IINS had a high turnaround rate from those on the run for being caught taking bribes or those who were locked away. Thanks, I appreciate it. He smiled and tried to mean it. He was never a big fan of ominous portent. Martha's eyes closed, and she seemed to deflate a bit. Wow. That bad, huh? He could tell she was physically exhausted from the experience. Maybe I should have asked it more questions? It was definitely she. Martha slowly sat up, though obviously it was a physical effort. Do you have any coffee? That was a big one. What kind of spirit was it? Time. I've heard about them, but I've never felt one before. Certainly not that powerful. They're as direct a source as you're ever going to find. He wasn't familiar with them, but he could look it up on the government files later. One of the advantages of his position was access to some pretty impressive data on various immigrants. He kind of had to have it to be able to know what not to let into the country. They tried the dumbed-down version 3 years before with utterly disastrous results. He picked up his coat and asked, So are we done here? Martha chuckled. I am if you are. Why do you have something else in mind? Her eyebrows went up. Hastur sputtered for a moment uncomfortably and then said, no. She pinched his cheek and then left the room. The ride home was uneventful. A few pixies smashed into his windshield, but they did that every day. These days, most immigrants didn't like the IINS. Hastur couldn't blame them on a certain level, but then again, were the natives really that wrong to want to control their retreat? His apartment was on the 3rd floor of the 5th building of the 9th ugliest building in Washington, D.C. All the trade papers agreed that it was a horrible place to live, and that since they thought that, everyone thought that. Which was just fine with Hastur, because that made it cheap. Very cheap. A pack of drunken brownies morphing magic reclamation zones, or raw sewage that was all telemagically piped in from the South American and African countries, bent on revenge from most of the 20th century, didn't hurt the price either. Warding spirits and turpentine kept most of the insects and disease under control, but they refused to do anything about the smell. That was just as well. Hastur had lost his ability to smell when he was 8. Chester the Orc was leaning against a lamp pole when Hastur parked his car. Evening, Hastur. Evening, Chester. How are things? Hastur closed the door and went around the trunk of the car to get where he'd put his briefcase. Great. Looking up. Always looking up. We got big things planned. You could be part of those big things. Chester rubbed his claws together. Thanks, but no thanks, Chester. I'm pretty sure it's a bad idea. Hastur had tried going in on one of Chester's schemes once, and it ended up inside a duffel bag being shipped out to China. If the Coast Guard hadn't found the boat, he would have been looking at life much differently. Chester groaned. That was one time that things went badly. You're not going to let that go? No, Chester, I'm not. Chester shrugged and then kicked the pavement. Fine, suit yourself. Be noble and poor for the rest of your life. Noble, not poor. I got a 401k. Right. Hastur looked at him as he opened the door. Hey, it's a government 401k. It's as good as gold in the bank. Right. Hastur ignored him and stomped up the stairs to an empty apartment. Everything was orderly, clean, and tidy. This wasn't because Hastur was a neat freak. Heaven knows his desk was a mess, but he simply didn't move anything or use enough to make it a mess in the first place. It was a laziness combined with absolute need for order. Order existed in spades back at the office. It was a government office. It was IINS to the boot. Here, not so much. So he did what he could, as he could, which in this case would be almost nothing. He lived alone. He didn't date. He had no friends outside of the office. It was a pretty miserable life, but it was his. Hastur wanted to make himself believe that it was for the greater good, but that wasn't true either. There were things he liked about the job, to be sure. He liked being able to help people who really needed asylum. They were out there. Of course they were out there. The omnipresence was out there, so they wanted to get away as far away from it as they could. That would be Earth, and since all of them suddenly found Earth to be an attractive place to live, the United States wanted to keep them out, except in very measured doses, of course. He picked up the phone and ordered a pizza. He kept it small. He didn't exercise much, but in the event he actually met a female he wanted to impress, he didn't want her to be a blob, or he didn't want to be a blob. He learned that in college. Fat guys don't get dates, at least fat guys who aren't rich. For a moment, his mind went back to Chester's scheming, but only for a moment. He kept reminding himself that the government had the best divinations that money could buy. If it wasn't illegal, it wasn't wise to put in his bank. If it wasn't legal, it wasn't wise to put it into his bank account. That night, Hastur had many nightmares, but the one that stuck out the most in his mind was the one where he kept getting devoured and regurgitated by the leopard. He knew he was dreaming, but that didn't stop him, the feeling of corrosive saliva and slime from covering every inch of his skin. After the 5th time this happened, he had had enough. He stood up after the leopard spewed him out and demanded, "What do you want? Why do you keep doing this?" The leopard looked puzzled and asked, "Why?" Hastur jumped up and down, shouting, "That's what I want to know," until he woke up. Dawn had come. Even though he had slept, he did not feel rested. Today was not going to be a good day. He managed to zombie his way through the rest of the morning, processed those in line, pushing those who had complications too weird for him to handle further up the food chain, or sending those who had improper paperwork back into the line. He tried to catch a nap on his break, but all he could do was look at the ceiling. He waited until lunch and then approached Cinderella. Everyone called her that, even though her name was Yasmin. She wasn't actually an immigrant. Thus far, none of them had been hired by the INS. Theoretically, any citizen could apply, but it was common wisdom that various elements that ran the U.S. intelligence community weren't going to take chances with them all. Yasmin had earned her nickname because of her fixation with shoes. Right now, she was wearing glass boots embossed with some kind of sparkling pixie dust. They actually glowed. "What's up, Hass?" She looked at him with an eye at his chocolate milk. She wasn't really a friend, but she tolerated his questions in exchange for the occasional food item. "I got a problem," he said as he took a bite out of his hot dog. "What kind of problem?" She took the chocolate milk from Hastur's tray without batting an eyelash. Payment was now delivered. "I had an augury done, and it doesn't sound good." He continued eating the hot dog, making sure he didn't talk with his mouth full. "Details?" She looked ponderously at the ceiling while she put the straw in the milk. "I'm supposed to find true love and get eaten by a leopard. There's also some stuff about the greatest strength and greatest weaknesses and all that, but I don't remember much." "Why didn't you write it down?" She began to sip the milk. Hastur shrugged. "There wasn't time?" "Oh, you were too lazy?" Yasmin knew him very well. "Well, don't go looking at me. You're not my type." Hastur coughed off his hot dog onto the plate and said, No, I didn't think I was." Yasmin looked indignant. "You say that like it's a good thing. You should be sad you aren't my type, pencil pusher. You don't know what you're missing. Anyway, advice for the milk. Don't try to avoid it." "The augury?" Hastur asked, eyeing the rest of the hot dog. "Yep. Everyone I know says that's the worst thing you can do. You have to face it head on." "But eaten by a leopard?" he asked. "There are worse things." Yasmin stood up. Hastur could tell she was still upset at him. "Like what?" "Like not being my type," she smiled, winked, and left the cafeteria. The afternoon was worse than the morning. He was wide awake now, and the hairs on the back of his neck were starting to stand out on end. Hastur understood why people wanted to avoid auguries in the first place. If he couldn't avoid it, what was he supposed to do? He considered buying a really sharp knife or something. What if the leopard ate him whole? Maybe he could cut his way out of it. Are you okay? The fish hovered 3 feet up in the air, said, bringing Hastur back to the present. Fine. Hastur tried not to let the annoyance in his voice show. He failed. The fish looked hurt. I was just asking. I'm fine. Reason for your visa request? The fish said, I'm requesting asylum. So was everyone else in line. In fact, everyone was requesting asylum these days. Hastur tried not to let it bother him. Maybe one of the immigrants would be a tourist or seeking temporary work permit one day. Other branches of the INS still got those. Have you filled out Form 52I? No, I don't have hands. The fish looked upset now. There was a note of panic in his voice. You'll need to find a designated agent then. Please report to the advocate department. They're out the hall and 3 doors to the left. You'll also need to fill out Form 22J. Hastur stamped his log. Next! The fish looked panicked. But I don't have hands. Let them know that. They'll be able to help you. Can't you do it? The fish asked. I could grant you a wish. Wishes are taxable income. Any form of taxable income is forbidden to designated government agents. The good news is that that will prove you can support yourself, which should help you get approval. The fish looked somewhat mollified. Really? Yes, really. Now move on, please. You're slowing up the line. The fish left. The goblin, the gnome, the boa constrictor, and a little tin teapot were all even more annoying. He checked the disposable curse detector, but it was solid green. Whatever bad luck he was having today was plain old ordinary non-magic variety, if you could call that ordinary. Hastur had seen enough things before the immigrants to know that some humans were just amazingly lucky. And to end the day, there was also another unicorn. It just waltzed on through, and everybody let it, of course. He went home, he ate, he came back to work. Each day was worse. The number of unicorns was steadily increasing until 8 days after he'd met Martha, there were 12 unicorns in an hour. Hastur was not a magician, but this had to mean something. He consulted with human resources, then they referred to him to security. He arrived at the security office when they were changing shift. He walked up to the desk and saw a large burly man wearing 2 pistols. Hastur couldn't help but notice the twin broadswords strapped to his back. The security guard's name tag said Omnibus. That was it. No first name, no last name, just Omnibus. Yes, the large man asked. I'm here to decontaminate. Hastur hated that term. Omnibus winced and said, Right. Let's go upstairs. You have the paperwork? Hastur handed him the requisite forms. They went upstairs. The large, squat room was entirely gray. All along the outer doors there were Norse runes of some kind that glowed softly under the dimmed fluorescent lights that were laced into the ceiling everywhere else in the building. They both walked to the middle of the room, and a large pentagram shot up. Red ghost worship? He asked. Curse removal, industrial strength. If you have anything on you, we'll find it. There was a great flash of light. Thunder pealed in the background, and for a moment Hastur thought the room would start turning around and around as if they were in some kind of gigantic microwave oven, but in the end it stopped. Omnibus gave a thumbs-up symbol and grinned. Great, you're clean. Great, thanks, I appreciate it. Hastur shook his head and went back downstairs to work. It looked like it was going to be a great day. The people were nice, they didn't complain, all he had to do was the proper paperwork. The leopard ate him at 3:32 p.m. He was sitting there, minding his own business, when this gorgeous female Amazon, probably 7 feet tall, skips past everyone else in the line and demands to be let forward past everyone else. I'm sorry, miss, but you'll have to go back to the end of the line. I am an Omega Circle sorceress. I shall do no such thing. Do my bidding, little man. She said this with complete and utter self-confidence. But speaking with the weight of the entire United States government behind him, Hastur said, I'm sorry, ma'am, but your bidding is against regulations. I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to go to the end of the line. She said, You're joking. Nope. You really mean it? Yep. You're aware of what I can do? I've got some idea, yes. Apparently, in retrospect, he didn't have an idea because she summoned the leopard, which ate him. When he woke up, he found himself in a long line. The details escaped him at first. There were a lot of immigrants, but a lot of regular people. The more time went on, the more he realized just what an anomalous state this was until he finally left the line and began to walk forward. As he did so, he noticed a large sign that says, Afterlife Immigration Office. There were 2 desks populated by a green ghost and a red ghost. They had mounds of paperwork on their desks and were furiously scribbling. No one had moved out of line, and no one else moved to talk to them. After several moments, a green ghost finally looked up and said, Next! And the line moved forward. Hastur hated bureaucracy. He considered going back to the back of the line. It was the proper thing to do. It was the right thing to do. But he also knew it was the stupid thing to do. He looked from the green ghost and then to the red ghost and approached the red ghost. Hey, you look tired. Can I get you something? Maybe a cup of coffee? The red ghost looked annoyed at first, but his expression changed to confusion and pleasant surprise when Hastur spoke to him. Why, sure, I haven't had a break in 12 years. Great. Where's your coffee pot? The red ghost pointed back behind him. Employee break room. First door on the right. You can't miss it. Thanks. The employee break room wasn't a big deal. They had a nicer room than the IINS, but nothing that Hastur hadn't seen before in most federal buildings. He put a cup of coffee on the pot and then waited. He poured the cup and then went back to the red ghost. There you go. Sure enough, the red ghost's curiosity was piqued, and there was his file on the top of the list. He could tell from the red ghost's expression that he was just waiting for him to ask for some kind of favor. Hastur didn't. He moved back towards the line and stopped a moment. He turned around and looked at the green ghost, which was looking somewhat annoyed. Say, you want some coffee too? The green ghost went from a frown to smile instantly. Yes, actually. It's been 40 years since my last break. We don't have a union. Of course. I'll be right back. Both the red ghost and the green ghost looked at him with such confusion that they never noticed him quietly grab his case file as he walked by. Instead of returning to the employee break room, he took the door that said exit. Hastur was well aware of the fact that if there was no case file, there was no problem in almost any system. There were quite a bit of stairs, but eventually he found the manhole cover and returned to the mortal realm. He pinched himself, yep, body and all. It had been a bit of a gamble. He had no idea what would happen, but the fortune teller had told him what he really needed to know. Death had a way of putting things in perspective. He quit his job at the IINS the next day. So, this story started out A+, and I see why it was not accepted despite being out of the park. One of the better stories I've written. One of my weaknesses in writing, and I've gotten over it, especially with the Fate of Inglemia that I'm currently writing, Army of Fire, is I always make sure I have a good ending. Like I'd like to think I do better endings better than Stephen King, because every writer has their problems, and mine is always going to be at the end of the day, I'm just not that good a writer. I get better because that's something that you can improve, but I'm never going to be naturally gifted and, show up in author English classes. I doubt a middle schooler a century from now is going to be writing an English paper on what was the real motivation for why Rhombus Ticks decided to have the green and the red ghost in the afterlife. It's not going to happen like that. But even though I have some good endings, pacing at that time, and to a certain degree still, was my greatest weakness, right? I mean, it starts out really simple, identifiable, interesting characters, and then the end. And it works, but it's very rushed compared to the rest of the story. It's fun. I'll be honest, of all the stories that I have in this collection, this is the one that tempts me to go back and write a novella, right? If you think of a pilot, which sometimes they do for television, it's like the first episode sometimes they never use it as the first episode. But basically a pilot is in television is kind of like a proof of concept. Like, you do a whole bunch of them, 8 or 9 or 10, and then the studio execs say, we like A, B, and, try C, doing it this way and come back and let us see if it works. And, it's a proof of concept. It's a way of actually seeing if something works. And Hastur is interesting, and the setting is interesting. I don't think I would want to write a novel in this setting, mainly because it's very derivative. When I wrote it, it was very original. Since then, fairy tales have been deconstructed to the point, between Fables and Sandman and Once Upon a Time, the genre has been done to death. And I do have a very interesting spin on it, which is bureaucracy meets fantasy. But having him quit at the end is not the way to go, right? Hastur should have some kind of an arc, and this could easily become an entire novella unto itself. But as it is, not only does it end too quickly, but it ends in a way that prevents any future stories. So if I like it. It has a lot of potential, but it also needs some work.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. redanvilcreative.com. Contains all our podcasts. Copyright
2022!
To fight the forces of evil!